1984 fight over who got to sell ice cream in the East End of Glasgow ended with a fire that took the lives of 6 members of one family. It sounds impossible. It happened. And it is only one chapter in a story that runs for more than 100 years. For a century, the same few square miles of Glasgow have produced some of the most feared gangs in Britain. The story begins with crews carrying open blades through the back streets of Bridgeton. From there, it runs through the reign of a man so powerful that people called him the Godfather. Across this video, we will walk through that whole century, from the back streets of Bridgeton to a sunny bar on the coast of Spain, follow how a feud gets handed down like an inheritance to the next generation. Section 1. Billy Boys and the Norman Conks, 1920s, 1930s. To understand how bad things got in Glasgow in later years, you have to go back to the time between the 2 world wars. The city was crowded, money was tight, and steady work was hard to find. In neighbourhoods like Bridgeton and the Gorbals, young men started grouping together by street and by area. A lot of these gangs cared about one thing only: turf. They guarded their few blocks and chased off anyone from the next scheme over. But a couple of them carried something heavier than turf, and that was religion. Glasgow had a deep divide between Protestants and Catholics. 2 gangs turned that divide into a daily fight. They were part of a much bigger scene. The city was full of crews back then, with names like the Beehive Boys and the Sans Toy. And many of their members carried open blades. It is how the gangs of this whole era are still remembered today. Out of all of them, 2 stood out above the rest. Most famous was the Billy Boys, based around Bridgeton Cross in the East End. They were Protestant. They got going around 1924, led by a man named William Fullerton, who everyone called Billy. The gang took its name partly from him and partly from King William of Orange, figure many Protestants in Scotland looked up to. Bridgeton Cross was their patch, and they treated it like a base. What set the Billy Boys apart was how organised they were. They behaved less like a street gang and more like a small private outfit. They wore a kind of uniform, marched in parades behind their own bands, and even wrote their own songs. At the end of a gathering, they would sing "God Save the King." By some accounts, the gang grew to several hundred members, making it one of the biggest in the city. There was a junior squad too, called the Derry Boys, made up of teenagers being trained up to join the main group one day. Members paid a small fee every week, a bit like dues. Money helped members who had just come out of prison, buying them food and clothes until they got back on their feet. For years, people treated the Billy Boys like local heroes, and Fullerton was painted as a tough man protecting his own community. More recent work by historians has pushed back hard on that picture. The historian Andrew Davies has argued that Fullerton was no hero at all. He had ties to a far-right group called the British Fascists, and he was jailed in 1930 in a case involving the way he treated his wife. Friendly neighbourhood protector story simply does not hold up. On the other side stood the Norman Conks. They were Catholic, based around Norman Street, which sat only about half a kilometre from the Billy Boys patch. The name Conks was short for conquerors, small joke playing on the old Norman conquest from English history. The gang had deep roots in the area, going back to the late 1800s, and it lasted in one form or another for decades. One detail that often gets left out is that the Conks counted young women among their members, not just men. Being that close together was a recipe for trouble. The 2 groups were almost neighbours, so they ran into each other all the time. The Billy Boys also went out of their way to provoke the other side. They would march straight through Catholic streets, including Norman Street itself, knowing exactly what would happen next. Sometimes it was just for show. Often it ended in a fight. One of these clashes turned into something close to a legend. After the Billy Boys pushed into Norman Street, the conks were ready and waiting. By the time it was over, nearly every Billy Boy had been hurt, either by the conks or by the police, who waded in to break it up. The story goes that the only member to walk away without a scratch was the big drum player, who had climbed inside his own drum to hide. It sounds like a comedy sketch, but it shows just how serious these run-ins could get when both sides came prepared. Football made everything worse. Matches between Rangers and Celtic were already tense because the two clubs were tied to the very same Protestant and Catholic split that ran through the whole city. In 1934, around 500 Rangers supporters, with Billy Boys among them, went after Celtic fans arriving at Bridgeton Cross Station. In the middle of the chaos, one of them cut a man with a blade, caught and sent to prison for 4 years. A petition signed by tens of thousands of people was put together to get him released early, and it got nowhere. That heavy sentence was a sign of things to come. For most of the 1920s and into the 1930s, this rivalry ran more or less unchecked. The gangs were too big, too organised, too tied into their own communities for the old style of policing to handle. The fighting spilled into streets, train stations, football grounds, and ordinary people kept getting caught in the middle. To many Glaswegians, it must have felt like the gangs, not the law, the ones truly running certain parts of the city. That feeling would not last much longer. By the early 1930s, the men in charge of Glasgow had decided enough was enough, and they brought in one outsider with a single job: break the gangs, no matter what it took. What he did next would change policing across Britain for good, and there was nothing gentle about it. Section 2, Percy Sillitoe and the Crackdown on the Gangs, 1931-1943. By the start of the 1930s, the men who ran Glasgow knew they had a problem they could no longer ignore. The gangs were too strong, the fighting was too open, ordinary people were frightened. So they went looking for someone who had already dealt with this kind of thing somewhere else. The man they found was Percy Sillitoe. Sillitoe was not a Glasgow man at all. He was born in London in 1888, and long before he ever wore a police uniform in Britain. He had spent years working as a mounted officer in southern Africa. Experience mattered. It was out there, handling rough and dangerous work, that he first learned how to break up organised groups of fighting men. When he came back to Britain, he worked his way up through smaller police forces, then landed the top job in Sheffield. At the time, Sheffield had a serious gang problem of its own, the real-life version of the kind of crews later made famous by the show Peaky Blinders. Sillitoe broke them. That success is exactly why Glasgow wanted him. He became Chief Constable of the City of Glasgow Police in 1931. He would lead the force for more than 10 years. He saw the city clearly. In his eyes, Glasgow was being overrun by gangs who bullied ordinary citizens and fought each other openly in the streets. He decided the only way to stop them was to hit back even harder than they did. His plan was simple and blunt. The gangs were tough, so he built a police force that was tougher. He went out and recruited big, strong men, many of them from the countryside and the Scottish Highlands, gave them basic training and a uniform, and pointed them straight at the gangs. The idea was to fight fire with fire, hot. These officers were not there to gently move people along. They were there to face down the hard men of Bridgeton and the Gorbals and win. The horses came next. Sillitoe brought in mounted officers, men on horseback who could clear a large crowd in seconds. People started calling them Sillitoe's Cossacks, after the famous horsemen of Russia. Sending horses charging into a packed street full of gang members was a terrifying thing to be on the wrong end of. and that was the whole point. Force grew until it was around 1,500 officers strong, and it picked up a nickname of its own. Some folk started calling the Glasgow police the biggest gang in the city, because that was now how they operated against the rest. Tough policing was only half of it. The courts backed Sillitoe up. Judges at the High Court began handing out heavy sentences for things that had once been treated lightly. Simply being caught carrying a blade could now land you as much as 5 years behind bars. For gang members who were used to soft punishments, this was a real shock. Leaders were arrested, locked up and pulled off the streets, and the message was loud and clear. The easy days were finished. Here is the part that surprises people. Sillitoe was not just a heavy hand, he was also a serious moderniser who dragged British policing into a new age. He brought in radio cars, so officers could talk to headquarters while they were out on patrol, instead of running to a roadside police box to make a call. He set up a proper fingerprint lab. He began using civilian staff in jobs that did not need a fully trained officer. And he introduced the black and white checkered band that you still see on police caps today. It was added to help people spot officers quickly in a crowd, and it is still known around the world as the Sillitoe tartan, named after him, worked. Slowly, the great gangs of the 1920s and 1930s started to fall apart. The Billy Boys, once strong enough to march straight through rival streets, lost their grip. Some of their leaders were in prison. Others simply gave up because the cost of carrying on had become too high. There was one more thing that helped Sillitoe out, and it had nothing to do with policing. The end of the 1930s came around. The Second World War pulled huge numbers of young men out of the city and into the armed forces. The same lads who might once have spent their nights fighting over a few streets were now in uniform, sent far from form, sent far from home. Between the steady police pressure and the war, the old gang culture faded away. All of this made Sillitoe famous. People called him the Hammer of the Gangs. He was knighted in 1942, and by the time he left Glasgow, he was probably the best-known police officer in the whole country. His career did not stop there either. He later went on to run the security service, better known as MI5, but his real legacy was simpler than any of that. He had proven that the gangs were not unbeatable. With enough force, enough nerve, justice system, willing to stand behind him, even Glasgow's worst could be brought under control. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. And yet, the calm he won did not hold forever. Sillitoe had broken the gangs of his day, but he had never touched the things that created them in the first place. The poverty was still there. Crowded, run-down schemes were still there. A generation later, in the 1960s, a brand new wave of gangs would rise up out of those same streets. And these ones would be younger, faster, and in some ways even more dangerous than anything that had come before. Section 3. New Wave. Glasgow's young gangs of the 1960s, 1965-1970. For a while, it looked like Glasgow had won. The big gangs of the past were broken. The Second World War had scattered the young men who once filled their ranks, and the streets were calmer than they had been in years. Calm is not the same as cured. The poverty never went away, and neither did the cramped, run-down housing. So when a new generation of teenagers grew up in those same conditions, the gangs came roaring back. This time they looked different. To a lot of people they looked worse. The new wave hit between about 1965 and 1968. Newspapers, police, politicians all began talking about a fresh gang problem. And the way they described it caused something close to public panic. These were not the older, semi-organised crews of the 1930s. The new gangs were younger, sometimes just kids in their early teens, and they had a reputation for being quick to fight and hard to control. Historians who later studied this period found that the fear often ran ahead the facts. The gangs were real, but the headlines made them sound like an army taking over the whole city. Either way, the worry was genuine, spread fast. What drove these gangs was territory, plain and simple. Each crew claimed a patch of streets or a block of flats and defended it against everyone else. Cross into the wrong area, wearing the wrong colours or saying the wrong thing. And you were asking for trouble. Most famous of all these groups came out of the Colton district in the East End. They were called the real Colton Tongs, and their patch became so well known that the area itself picked up the nickname Tongland. The Tongs did more than just fight. They ran a protection racket, leaning on local shops, and forcing owners to hand over money to be left in peace. They marked their turf with their name, and they had a rallying shout that stuck in the public mind for years. It was Tongs Yabas. Nobody is completely sure where the second part comes from. Some say it is just rough local slang. Others think it goes all the way back to an old Gaelic fighting phrase. Whatever the truth, the shout caught on so widely that Tongs Yabas became something like an unofficial motto for Glasgow. Through the 1960s and 1970s, Tongs were not alone either. Other crews sprang up across the city, like the Spur from the Barrowfield area, each one guarding its own few streets. There was a bigger force at work behind all of this, and it had to do with where people lived. Around this time, the city was tearing down its old, overcrowded inner-city tenements and moving huge numbers of families out to enormous new housing estates on the edge of Glasgow. Easterhouse was one of several giant schemes thrown up almost overnight, alongside places like Castlemilk, Drumchapel, Pollock. On paper it was progress, fresh homes to replace the slums. In practice, the planners forgot something important. They built thousands of houses, but barely any shops, clubs, or places for young people to go, bored teenagers with nothing to do, and nowhere to be simply rebuilt their gangs in the new estates, and the same old fights followed them out to the edge of the city. One moment from this era really captured the public imagination. In 1968, a famous singer named Frankie Vaughan stepped right into the middle of the Easterhouse gang scene. Vaughan was a national star, and he used his fame to try something bold. He went out to the estate, spoke directly to the gangs, organised what became known as a blade amnesty. The idea was simple. Gang members could hand in their blades, no questions asked, give peace a chance. He also pushed hard for a youth centre to be built. So the young people there would finally have somewhere to go. Some people praised him for caring. Others said a one-off visit from a celebrity could never fix problems this deep. Both sides had a point. But at the very least, Vaughan threw a national spotlight on what life was actually like in Glasgow's forgotten schemes. The young gangs of the 1960s never fully disappeared. But over the following years, they slowly changed shape. Through the 1970s and into the 1980s, the city's underworld began to shift. Harder drugs started flooding into Glasgow, and where there are drugs, there is serious money. Fighting over a few streets for pride was one thing. Fighting over who controlled the sale of drugs across whole districts was something else. Entirely. Far more dangerous and far more profitable. The simple turf fights of the teenage gangs were quietly turning into organised crime. Same gang names and rivalries would echo on for decades, and they even showed up later in films and books about the city. But the real story they pointed to was much darker than any movie. Because while bored teenagers were shouting slogans and guarding their corners, a very different kind of figure was rising quietly through Glasgow's underworld. He had no interest in street pride or marching bands. He cared about money, power, and control, and over the next 30 years he would become the most feared man in the city. In time, come to call him the Godfather. Section 4. Arthur Thompson, the Godfather, the Welsh family feud, 1960s. While the young gangs of the schemes were busy guarding their corners, one man was building something far bigger and far quieter. His name was Arthur Thompson, and over the space of about 30 years he became the most powerful figure in Glasgow's underworld. People called him the Godfather. For once the nickname actually fit. Born in Glasgow in 1931, in the tough industrial district of Springburn, Thompson came up the hard way. He got his start as a moneylender, and the idea was simple. He lent people cash, then charged them heavy interest to pay it back. If they could not, or would not, he made sure they regretted it. He became known across the city for the frightening ways he dealt with anyone who failed to pay him. That fear was the real engine of his business. Once people were scared of him, they paid on time and word spread. From there, his world grew. He moved into protection rackets, squeezing money out of businesses in return for being left alone. He took part in robberies and large jobs for a while, and as the cash piled up, he did something clever that set him apart from ordinary street gang leaders. He poured his dirty money into legal businesses. On the surface, he looked like a successful local businessman. Underneath, those businesses helped hide and grow a fortune built on fear. By doing this, Thompson turned himself from a common thug into something much harder to touch. A respectable face with a criminal empire sitting behind it. Power like that always draws enemies, and Thompson had a big one. They were known as the Welsh family, rival group, who wanted a slice of what he had built. The bad blood between them boiled over in 1966, in an event that nearly ended Thompson's life, and showed everyone just how dangerous his world had become. One day that year, someone planted a hidden device under Thompson's car. When the engine started, it went off. Thompson himself survived. The blast took the life of his mother-in-law, who was sitting in the passenger seat right beside him. It was a shocking moment. This was no longer a fist fight between teenagers over a few streets. This was an attempt to wipe out a man and his whole family in one go. Thompson had no doubt about who was behind it. He believed the Welsh family had tried to finish him, and he was not the kind of man to let that slide. Soon after, he spotted two of the men he blamed, Patrick Welsh and James Goldie, out on the road. What happened next was ruthless. Two men died when Thompson's vehicle struck the car they were travelling in. Thompson was arrested and put on trial over their deaths. But when the case reached court, he was found not guilty and walked free. That outcome told Glasgow everything it needed to know. Going up against Arthur Thompson was a fast way to get yourself hurt. And even when the law came knocking, he had a habit of slipping out of its grip. Over the years, he survived more than one attempt on his life, which only added to his legend. People began to whisper that he had 9 lives. Each time someone tried to take him down and failed, his reputation grew, and fewer people were willing to challenge him. 1970s and into the 1980s, Thompson sat at the very top of the city's underworld. To protect himself, he turned his home into a kind of fortress. It was made up of 2 ordinary council houses knocked together, and locals gave it a famous nickname, Ponderosa, after the ranch in an old cowboy show. From there, Thompson ran his affairs like the head of a family business, because in a way that is exactly what it was. As the years rolled on, the business changed with the times. Biggest money was no longer in lending or protection. It was in drugs, and the Thompson family moved into that trade too. This side of things was increasingly run by Thompson's son, also called Arthur, who was being groomed to take over the empire one day. by some accounts. At the height of his power, Thompson was pulling in around £100,000 every single week. For a boy from Springburn who started out lending small sums on street corners, it was an astonishing rise. What made Thompson so dangerous was not just his willingness to use fear. It was his patience and his brains. He understood that the loud, flashy gang leader usually ends up in prison or worse. So he stayed in the shadows, kept his businesses looking clean, and let his reputation do most of the work for him. For 3 full decades, that quiet approach kept him on top while rivals came and went around him. He was living proof that in Glasgow, real power did not belong to the kid with the loudest shout, belonged to the calm man with the deepest pockets and the longest memory. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Thompson's grip on the city felt unbreakable, while the godfather that ruled the established underworld, a strange and deadly new conflict was already brewing out in the housing schemes. It would not be fought over pride or family honour. It would be fought over something that sounds almost laughable until you learn the truth behind it, and it would end in one of the worst tragedies in the entire history of Scottish crime. Section 5. The Ice Cream Van Conflict and the Doyle Family Tragedy, 1980s. This is the story most people find hardest to believe, because of how it began. In the early 1980s, a turf fight broke out across Glasgow's East End housing schemes, and the thing everyone was fighting over was ice cream vans. It sounds like a joke. It was anything but. To understand it, you have to understand what those vans really were. In the big estates like Ruchazie and Easterhouse, there were hardly any proper shops nearby, so ice cream vans drove from street to street, selling sweets, cigarettes, and everyday bits and pieces right to people's doors. For a lot of families, the van was the corner shop that made the routes incredibly valuable. And some operators had worked out that the same vans, driving the same trusted rounds, perfect cover for selling drugs and other dodgy goods on the side. Whoever controlled the best routes controlled a steady flood of cash, so the operators started fighting over them. At first, it was rough but limited. Rival crews would raid each other's vans, smash them up, try to scare drivers off the good streets. Then it got worse. People began firing at the vans themselves to send a message. What looked from the outside like a silly squabble over selling cones was really a serious turf fight, and it was heading somewhere terrible. At the centre of it was a young driver named Andrew Doyle. He was 18 and he drove a van for a local firm. Doyle had a problem that would end up costing him everything. He refused to play the game. He would not let his route be used to push drugs, and he would not hand his round over to the people trying to take it. For standing his ground, he was targeted. Shots were fired through the windscreen of his van to scare him into giving up. Doyle still refused to back down, so the people leaning on him decided to send a far bigger warning. What happened next, in the early hours of the 16th of April 1984, became one of the darkest moments in Scottish history. Doyle lived with his family in a top-floor flat in Ruchazie. In the middle of the night, while everyone inside was asleep, someone poured petrol on the door of the flat and set it alight. The fire tore through the home. 9 people were inside that night, including guests. 6 of them did not make it out. The people who lost their lives were almost an entire family. James Doyle, the father, was 53. His daughter, Christina, was 25. Her little boy, Mark, was just 18 months old. 3 of James's sons died as well, including Andrew, the young van driver who had refused to give in. The youngest brother was only 14. In a single night, the Doyle family was nearly wiped out. At the time, it was the worst loss of life from a single act in Scotland's history. The whole country was horrified. and the pressure on the police to find those responsible was enormous. Several people were arrested, and in the end 6 were charged. 4 were convicted of crimes linked to the wider feud. The other 2, Thomas Campbell and Joe Steele, put on trial for the deaths of the Doyle family, found guilty in 1984, and sentenced to life in prison. But here is where the story takes another dark turn. The case against Campbell and Steele was shaky from the start. The main evidence came from a single man, William Love, who claimed he had heard Campbell talking about the plan, also a statement. Police said Campbell made, suggesting the fire had only ever been meant as a scare that went too far, plus a map, said to mark out the Doyle home. Both men insisted, loudly and constantly, that they were innocent, and they did not stay quiet about it. Joe Steele broke out of prison more than once to protest, and in one famous stunt, he glued himself to the gates of Buckingham Palace to force people to pay attention. Thomas Campbell went on hunger strike. Year after year, the 2 of them fought to clear their names. Then the case finally fell apart. William Love, the key witness, admitted he had made his evidence up. After a first appeal failed, the breakthrough came on the 16th of March 2004, when senior judges in Edinburgh threw out both convictions and ruled that the men had been victims of a serious miscarriage of justice. After 20 years behind bars, Campbell and Steele were free. But there was no real victory in it. Campbell saw it. Everyone in this story had lost. The Doyle family had lost 6 of their own. He and Steele had lost 2 decades of their lives for something the courts now accepted they did not do. And one haunting fact hung over all of it. Campbell and Steele did not start that fire. Then the people who did were never caught. To this day, the question of who actually took those 6 lives has never been answered. The tragedy showed just how dangerous Glasgow's underworld had become, even when the people caught in it were ordinary working families. But the danger was not only spilling out into the schemes, it was also creeping closer to the top, right into the heart of the city's most powerful criminal dynasty. Within a few years, the Godfather's own son and chosen heir would be taken in shocking fashion. What happened around his funeral would unsettle even the hardest men in Glasgow. Section 6. Fall of the Thompson Empire, 1991. For 30 years, Arthur Thompson had ruled Glasgow's underworld by staying patient and careful. But empires built on fear are fragile things, and the Godfather had one obvious weakness: his family. The man he wanted to take over one day was his son, also named Arthur. And the son was nothing like the father. People called the younger Thompson Fat Boy. On paper, he was the heir to a criminal empire, and he ran the drugs side of the family business. In reality, a lot of people in the underworld did not respect him at all. Where his father was quiet and clever, the son was loud and flashy. He liked to dress like a film gangster and throw the family name around, leaning on his father's fearsome reputation to push people about. To the genuine hard men of the city, he looked like a spoiled, rich kid playing at being a criminal. That lack of respect would prove fatal. On the 17th of August 1991, the younger Thompson was walking near the family compound. In the Proven Mill area, the cluster of homes locals called the Ponderosa. As he made his way between the houses, he was attacked, and he did not survive. The person responsible vanished into the night and was never officially identified. Over time, that unknown figure picked up an almost mythical nickname in Glasgow folklore: the Apprentice. For the Godfather, it was the ultimate blow. After decades of surviving everything thrown at him, he had failed to protect his own son and chosen heir. What came next turned an underworld death into a legend. The police soon focused on a man named Paul Ferris. Ferris was only 28. He was already well known across Glasgow. Years earlier, he had worked as muscle for the Thompson family, handling their dirty work. Then the two sides had a serious falling out. Ferris had spent time in prison, and he came to believe the Thompsons had betrayed him and left him to take the fall. That bad blood made him an obvious suspect when the heir to the empire was taken down, and he was arrested and charged. Before his trial could even begin, the story took a chilling turn. Ferris had two close associates, Bobby Glover and Joe Hanlon. Hanlon was known to many as Bananas, a nickname he earned not through anything sinister, but by once dressing up as a banana to raise money for charity. On the night before the younger Thompson's funeral, both men were found inside a parked car. Neither had survived. The car had been left on the very route the funeral procession was due to travel the following day. The message could not have been clearer. Whoever did it wanted the Thompson family and all of Glasgow to see those two men sitting on the road to the funeral. It looked like revenge, carried out by people who believed Glover and Hanlon had played a part in the loss of the heir. There was a grim twist, too. It was widely believed that, had they lived, the pair would have stood trial alongside Ferris. With them gone, he was left to face the courts alone, and he could not possibly have arranged their deaths himself, because by then he was already locked up. So Paul Ferris went on trial by himself, accused of ending the life of the Godfather's son. The case became enormous, turned into the longest criminal trial in Scottish history up to that point, and it reportedly cost around £4 million. The most astonishing moment of all came when Arthur Thompson Sr. himself took the stand to give evidence for the prosecution. Here was a man who had spent his entire life living by the underworld code of never speaking to the authorities. Yet, there he stood, the godfather of Glasgow, helping the courts try to send another man down. It showed just how badly he wanted someone to pay for his son. It did not work. After the marathon trial, Paul Ferris was found not guilty and walked free because the jury was not convinced the case against him held up. And so the central mystery stayed wide open. 3 men were now gone: the younger Thompson, Bobby Glover, and Joe Hanlon. Nobody was ever convicted for any of it. To this day, all 3 cases remain officially unsolved. The whole affair broke something inside the Thompson empire. The Godfather had lost the son he had spent years preparing for the top. His reputation as the untouchable master of the city was badly damaged, because everyone could now see that the one thing he truly cared about, his own family, had not been safe after all. He carried on for a while, but the spark was gone. Then, in March 1993, less than 2 years after his son, Arthur Thompson Sr. died as well. There was no dramatic ending for him. After a lifetime of surviving every attempt against him, the feared man in Glasgow simply died of a heart attack in his own bed as an old man. With the Godfather gone and his heir long buried, the empire he had spent 30 years building quietly fell apart. The age of one man sitting calmly at the very top of Glasgow's underworld was over for good. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That left a dangerous gap. When a king dies without a strong heir, others fight to take the throne, and Glasgow's underworld was no different. In the years that followed, a new generation of crime families pushed to fill the space the Thompsons left behind. 2 of them in particular would end up locked in a feud so long and so bitter that it would make almost everything before it looked tame. Section 7. The Lyons and Daniel feud begins. The Applorow Motors attack, 2006. With the old Godfather gone, Glasgow's underworld did not go quiet. It simply changed hands. In the north of the city, in tough areas like Milton and Postle Park, 2 families were growing in power, and they would come to despise each other more deeply than perhaps any 2 groups in the city's history. They were the Lyons and the Daniels. At first, they were not so different. Both came from the same corner of North Glasgow. Both were tangled up in the same kind of underworld activity, drugs at the centre of it. For a while, the two families were even said to be on friendly terms. But somewhere along the way, that changed. The exact spark is argued about to this day. Most accounts trace the bad blood back to the early 2000s, to a fallout involving money, drugs, theft, with one side feeling robbed and disrespected by the other. Whatever lit the fuse, once it caught, there was no putting it out. What started as a local dispute slowly grew into a full-blown feud. There were threats, attacks, and damaged property. Each side hit back at the other, and every strike only deepened the bitterness. For a few years it stayed below the radar, the kind of grudge most ordinary Glaswegians never heard about. Then, in December 2006, whole thing exploded into public view in the most shocking way imaginable. The setting was an ordinary MOT garage called Applero Motors in the Lambhill area. The garage was run by the Lyons family, and on that day there were people inside doing normal, everyday things. Two masked men walked in. They were armed, and they were there for one reason. In a matter of seconds, they attacked 3 people inside the garage. A 21-year-old named Michael Lyons did not survive. He was the nephew of a leading figure in the Lyons family, and he worked at the garage. 2 other men were hurt as well. One of them, Stephen Lyons, wounded but lived. Another, Robert Pickett, was seriously injured but also pulled through. What made it so chilling was how brazen it was. This was not a hidden strike in the dead of night. It happened in daylight, in a normal workplace, against people who never saw it coming. Prosecutor would later tell a court that the whole thing was like a scene from a gangster film. For once, that description was not an exaggeration. The attack sent a shockwave through Glasgow, told everyone that the Lyons and Daniel feud had crossed a line that even hardened criminals usually respected. Police threw huge resources at the case, and the work paid off. 2 men, Raymond Anderson and James MacDonald, were identified as the attackers. Both were linked to the Daniel side of the feud. In May 2008, Anderson and MacDonald were put on trial and found guilty. The sentences they received made history. Each man was ordered to serve 35 years in prison. At the time, those were the longest fixed prison terms ever handed down by a Scottish court. The judges wanted to send the strongest possible message that this kind of cold, planned attack would be punished as harshly as the law allowed. The 2 men later challenged their convictions, but the appeal court rejected them, and the convictions stood, although the length of the sentences was reduced on appeal further down the line. For a brief moment, it might have looked like justice had landed a decisive blow. 2 of the feud's most dangerous members were locked away. For decades, the garage attack had been solved, and the people responsible were behind bars. In most stories, that would be the end of it. But the Lyons and Daniel feud was not most stories, and if anything, record-breaking sentences only poured fuel on the fire. The reason was simple. This feud was never really about a single attack. It was about pride, revenge, and control of the streets. And those things do not disappear when a prison door shuts. It was also far bigger than any person. Where the razor gangs had faded and the Godfather's empire collapsed, once he and his heir were gone, fight ran through entire families and the wide web of friends and associates around them. Take out one member and another simply stepped up to carry the grudge forward. That is exactly why it would go on to outlast every other conflict in this story, dragging on for more than 2 decades and still going. There was something else that set this feud apart. The old gangs had mostly kept their business among themselves, fought in their own corners and their own pubs. This new generation was different. They were willing to strike in broad daylight, in public, in front of anyone who happened to be around. The 2006 garage attack had proven that, and it was only the beginning. Because the feud was about to produce a moment even more shocking than the garage. It would not take place in a quiet workshop tucked away in the north of the city. It would happen out in the open, in the middle of an ordinary afternoon, in a packed supermarket car park, full of families loading their shopping into their cars, and it would become one of the most brazen acts Glasgow had ever seen. Section 8, Kevin Goebel Carroll and the Asda car park attack, 2010. Of all the figures who fought in the Lyons and Daniel feud, few were as feared as Kevin Carroll. Everyone knew him by his nickname, Goebel. He was one of the most dangerous members of the Daniel side, kind of man other criminals were careful never to cross. He was tied to the family by more than just business, through his relationship with a woman who was part of the Daniel clan. For years, Carroll had been right at the sharp end of the feud, and he was widely believed to have taken part in some of its earlier attacks. That made him a marked man. By early 2010, Carroll had no shortage of enemies, and they had decided his time was up. What happened next would become one of the most talked about moments in the entire history of Glasgow crime. Not just because of who he was, but because of where and how it happened. It was the 13th of January 2010, a normal weekday around lunchtime. Carroll, who was 29, drove to an Asda supermarket in Robertson, in the north of the city. This was no dark back alley or quiet country road. It was a busy car park, full of ordinary people doing their weekly shop, loading bags into their cars with children in the back seats. Carroll had gone there for a meeting, and he was sitting inside a car when it began. A second car came tearing across the car park and stopped sharply nearby. Two men jumped out and went straight for him. The attack was sudden, close range, and merciless. The whole thing was over in roughly 25 seconds, and Kevin Carroll did not survive. Then the attackers were gone, speeding off and leaving a scene of total panic behind them. For the people in that car park, it was beyond terrifying. This was the middle of the day, in a place where families felt completely safe. One shopper later told a court that the scene was so chaotic and frightening that she feared she had walked into something far bigger, large-scale attack on the public. Picture standing there with your shopping bags, your kids beside you, watching something like that happen a few feet away. In that moment, the feud stopped being a problem for criminals only, spilled out into the open, and landed right in front of innocent bystanders. The whole country was horrified. Police came under enormous pressure to catch those responsible. But a case like this, frightened witnesses, and a closed criminal world that does not talk to the authorities, was never going to be easy. The road to justice turned out to be long and twisting. In 2012, a man named Ross Monaghan stood trial accused of the attack, but the case against him did not hold up. He was found not guilty, and he was also cleared of helping to get rid of the items used and of destroying the getaway car. For a while, it looked like no one would ever be held to account for what happened in that car park. Then, in 2015, breakthrough came. A man named William Patterson was put on trial. He denied everything, and even pointed the finger at several other people, insisting he had been somewhere else entirely. The jury did not believe him. After a trial lasting around 2 weeks at the High Court in Glasgow, Patterson was found guilty and ordered to serve at least 22 years in prison. The judge did not hold back. He said the attack had clearly been planned well in advance and carried out in the most calculated, cold-blooded way. This was not a fight that got out of hand or a flash of temper. It was a deliberate plan to end a man's life, worked out beforehand and carried through without mercy, in a spot where the public was bound to be caught in the chaos. Looking back, Carroll attack changed how ordinary Glaswegians saw the whole feud. For years, many had treated the Lyons and Daniel trouble as something distant, problem for gangsters that happened to other people in other circles. The supermarket car park shattered that comfort, proved. The feud had no limits and no shame, and that everyday people could suddenly find themselves only a few steps away from its worst moments. Two families had turned parts of their own city into places that could become dangerous without any warning at all. And still, even after all of that, the feud refused to stop. If anything, it kept growing. Carroll was gone. Two men had now been put on trial in connection with the worst of the conflict, and yet the cycle of payback simply rolled on. Behind the scenes, sides were arming themselves and planning their next moves, and the danger was about to reach a new and frightening scale. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. In fact, within just a few years, courts would hear something almost unbelievable. A judge would stand up and accuse members of these families of trying to turn parts of Glasgow to a place of open conflict, with a hidden stash of dangerous items and a list of people they intended to target. By that point, the feud was no longer a string of separate one-off attacks. It was beginning to look like a fully organised campaign, run with the planning and patience of a small private army determined to wipe the other side out. Section 9. An organised campaign. The Conspiracy Trials, 2016-2019. By the middle of the 2010s, the Lyons and Daniel feud had already been running for well over a decade. People had lost their lives, long prison sentences had been handed down, still the two sides kept circling each other. But something about the feud had quietly changed. In its early days, it had mostly been a series of separate flare-ups, one attack here, one act of revenge there. By now it had grown into something colder and more organised. This was no longer just two groups of angry men lashing out. It was starting to look like a planned operation, run with patience and care, built to wipe the other side out for good. Proof of just how organised it had become came out in court. In one of the most revealing cases of the entire feud, a period stretching from June 2016 to September 2017, a group of men connected to one side of the feud set about systematically hunting down members of the other. This was not a single moment of madness. It was a sustained effort that ran for more than a year, carefully aimed at a specific list of people tied to the Daniel family. What made the case stand out was its sheer reach. Targets were pursued not only in Glasgow, but across a far wider area, including North Lanarkshire, Renfrewshire, and even as far away as Manchester in England. The feud had outgrown its old North Glasgow roots. It now stretched across the country, one side, willing to travel hundreds of miles to get at the people they were after. The men involved had particular names in their sights, members and associates of the rival family, and they were determined to track them down wherever they went. To carry all this out, they needed equipment, and that is where the police investigation struck gold. As part of a major operation against the feud, officers searched a lock-up garage and uncovered a hidden stash of dangerous gear the group had been quietly gathering. The find left no doubt about how serious their intentions were. This was not bluster or empty threats. These were men preparing, in a cold and practical way, to take the lives of their rivals, and they had been collecting the tools to do it. When the case reached the High Court in Glasgow in 2019, 6 men were found guilty of plotting to take the lives of members of the rival family. Their names were Brian Ferguson, Andrew Gallagher, Robert Pickett, Andrew Sinclair, John Hardy, and Peter Bain. One of those names should sound familiar. Robert Pickett was the very same man who had been seriously hurt in the Aplarau Motors Garage attack back 2006. He had survived that day, and years later he surfaced again. This time not as a victim, but as one of the men convicted of plotting against the other side. His path from one to the other says everything about how this feud trapped people inside it, pulling them back in again and again across the years. The judge in the case, Lord Mulholland, was furious, and he made his feelings clear from the bench. He told the men the courts would never tolerate this kind of behaviour, and he condemned their actions as exactly the sort of gangster conduct that tears communities apart. In his strongest words, he said they had tried to turn Glasgow into a lawless place, where their private feud was settled out on public streets. He also flatly rejected any idea that this was simply a private matter between criminals that touched no one else. That, he said, could not be further from the truth, because feuds like this put ordinary, innocent people in danger every single day. He warned the men plainly that heavy punishment was coming their way. This case mattered for a reason beyond the convictions themselves, pulled back the curtain and showed the public exactly what the feud had become. This was not a hot-headed street fight that flared up and burned out. It was a long, deliberate, almost businesslike campaign, complete with planning, equipment, target lists, and members willing to cross the country to carry it out. The law was now treating the feud not as a string of unrelated crimes, but as an organised effort to do real and lasting harm. The charges were as serious as they come, and the message from the courts was that anyone caught taking part would face the heaviest possible consequences. And yet somehow not even this stopped it. By now, a chilling pattern had set in. Whenever the police landed a major blow, the feud would pause for breath, and then carry on as if nothing had happened. Fresh faces stepped into the gaps left by those sent to prison, and old grudges were handed down almost like an inheritance. The two families had been at each other for so long that the reasons it all began barely mattered anymore. The fight had taken on a life entirely of its own. What nobody could have predicted was just how far it would eventually spread. The feud was about to break out of Scotland altogether and go global. In 2025, it would erupt all over again, more fiercely than ever, reaching from the housing schemes of Glasgow to the streets of Edinburgh, to sun-soaked bars on the coast of Spain, and even to the deserts of the Middle East. And this time, it would drag in one of the most powerful criminal networks in all of Europe. Section 10. Feud goes global. The 2025 eruption. By 2025, the Lyons and Daniel feud had been simmering for around a quarter of a century. A lot of people assumed it had mostly burned itself out. The big names were aging, some were in prison, few had moved abroad to enjoy their money, far from the cold Glasgow streets where it all began. But the feud had not ended. It had only gone quiet for a while. And in 2025, it came roaring back with a fury that stunned even the people who thought they had seen it all. The spark this time came from an unexpected direction. A new figure had pushed his way into the story, a man named Ross McGill. McGill was not a traditional crime boss. He had first become known as a leader of a hardcore group of Rangers football supporters. But in early 2025, he set up a brand new crew called Tamo Junto, a name taken from Portuguese words meaning we are together. Whole purpose was revenge against the Daniel family and the people around them. What set McGill off was a deal that turned sour. What, according to widely reported accounts, a large drug shipment worth around £500,000 had been paid for using fake banknotes. McGill was left badly out of pocket and in debt to dangerous people, and he blamed a jailed Edinburgh figure named Mark Richardson, who had links to the Daniel side. From a base overseas, McGill is said to have directed a campaign of payback back home. The trouble spread fast across the central belt of Scotland. What followed was one of the most intense bursts of activity in the entire history, the feud. From around March 2025, Glasgow and Edinburgh were hit by a wave of deliberate fires, cars and homes set alight in the dead of night. People were attacked with blades. The homes of senior Daniel family members were targeted. Vehicles were burned out on their own turf in the north of the city. So, what made it feel chillingly modern was that some of the attacks were filmed and posted online, used almost like adverts to spread fear and send warnings to the other side. The most disturbing part was how the danger reached people who had nothing to do with any of it. In one incident in the Milton area of Glasgow, a 72-year-old woman and a 12-year-old boy were attacked inside a house. Over in Edinburgh, a 54-year-old businessman connected to Mark Richardson was badly hurt in a blade attack at his home, and it was not even the first time he had been targeted. The feud had stopped respecting boundaries completely. Anyone linked, even loosely, to the wrong side could end up caught up in it. Then came the moment that made headlines around the world. On the 31st of May 2025, two senior figures from the Lions side were relaxing in a bar in Fuengirola on the sunny Costa del Sol in Spain, watching a football match. Their names were Eddie Lyons Jr. and Ross Monaghan. A masked attacker appeared and struck. The first part of the attack faltered, giving Monaghan a chance to run inside the bar, but he was chased down and neither man survived. The attacker then slipped away through a quiet route with few cameras, fled across the border into Portugal, and eventually flew to England, where a man was later arrested in Liverpool in connection with the deaths. If those two names sound familiar, they should. Ross Monaghan was the very same man who had been put on trial years earlier over the supermarket car park attack on Kevin Carroll, and cleared. Eddie Lyons Jr. was the brother of Stephen Lyons, the head of the Lyons Group, and he himself had been wounded in an attack all the way back in 2006. Men who had survived this feud for decades had finally been caught up in it, far from home, on a holiday coast hundreds of miles from Glasgow. Here, though the facts need to be handled carefully, Spanish police stated that they believed the attacker was a member of the rival Daniel gang, who had planned the killings in detail. Police Scotland were far more cautious. They said there was nothing to suggest the deaths in Spain were connected to the ongoing feud back home, or that the attack had been planned in Scotland. So while it is tempting to tie everything together into one neat story, the honest answer is that the full truth has not yet been settled in court. What is certain is the sheer scale of what unfolded. Chaos drew in one of the most powerful criminal networks in Europe, the Kinahan cartel, an organisation whose reach stretches far beyond Britain. Trouble forced a huge police response, with a dedicated operation set up to deal with the endless tit-for-tat attacks, and more than 40 people arrested as the unrest rolled on. Key figures fled overseas, only for several of them, including Ross McGill and Stephen Lyons, to be tracked down and arrested in Dubai before being moved on again. The hunt for the people behind it all stretched right across continents. And that is where this story sits today. Not finished, not resolved, paused once again, with both sides bruised but still standing, and the people who fuel it scattered across the globe after more than 100 years. From straight blades in the back streets of Bridgeton to fake banknotes and threats posted online, Glasgow's gang story has never truly ended. Which leaves one last question worth sitting with. Not how all of this began, but whether a feud this old, this deep, and this stubborn can ever really be brought to a close, or whether it will simply find a new generation to pick it up and carry it on. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.